everyone. I'm Maureen Droney with the Recording Academy Producers and Engineers Wing, welcoming you to another episode of Inside the Mix, which today is part 2 of our 4-part series on Sony 360 Reality Audio. With us again, we have Gus Skinnis, Technical Support Lead on the Sony 360 team, who is also collaborating with Audio Futures in the development and support of the Walkmix creator, Sony 360 production tools, which are such a hot topic right now. Earlier in his career, Gus was involved in the development of workstations such as the Sonoma DSD recorder, the Studer Diaxis, the original Waveframe DAW. And in addition to his work with 360 RA, Gus also heads up the Super Audio Center in Boulder, Colorado. Joining Gus today is Bryce Jones. Bryce is Chief Product Officer at Virtual Sonics, Inc., and his career spans almost 30 years in both video games and music technology, where he has led or contributed to some of the most successful video game franchises and software platforms ever. His work with Microsoft, EA, Gameloft, and other studios ranges from software engineering and program management to organizational leadership as head of several video game studios. His body of work includes such AAA franchises as Fable, Zoo Tycoon, Halo, Dungeon Siege, and mobile franchises including Bejeweled, Oregon Trail, American Settler, and Dungeon Hunter. Bryce also contributed to the success of platforms including Xbox 360, DirectX, games for Windows, Xbox Live, and most recently, the Rolling Cloud service. He currently leads software production for Virtual Sonics, Inc. and Audio Futures, Inc., including in partnership with Sony Corporation and the Walkmix ecosystem for Sony 360 Reality Audio. Also joining us for the Q&A portion will be Virtual Sonics Chief Software Architect, Attila Fodor. Moderating Inside the Mix again today is 2-time Immersive Audio Album Grammy-winning engineer, Michael Romanowski. Our format, again, is about a half-hour of presentation and another half-hour for Q&A, so be sure to put your questions in the Zoom Q&A function. Now, over to you, Michael Romanowski.
Thank you so much. Thanks again to the P&E Wing for carrying on with this series. I think this is super important and bringing as much information as we can to our community about immersive audio and a deeper dive behind the scenes. And with that, thank you to Gus and Bryce and Attila for being here, giving us a behind the scenes look at the production of Sony 360. We're going to jump in today with a little deeper dive into the software for creating Sony 3 and an explanation for creating Sony 360 files. So, hey guys, want to jump on and say howdy? There we go. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. Gus, welcome back. Bryce, welcome here for the first time. Let's in the interest of time, let's just jump right in. Bryce, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you start off and get running.
Outstanding. Thank you, Michael. Hi, I'm Bryce Jones. You probably heard my long intro, but let's go ahead and just get started. I'm going to go a little technical today. And the goal of the presentation you're about to see is to kind of help educate people into thinking in 360 reality audio. I know that the prevalent paradigm for the longest time has been spatial audio. 360 is actually kind of the next evolution. Let me go ahead and just start my presentation here and share my screen for you.
While you're doing that, just a reminder to folks along the way, if you want to post any questions, feel free to do so in the Q&A section, not the chat, the Q&A.
Okay.
Go ahead, Bryce.
Okay. So the topic of today's presentation is thinking in 360. And so this is, I know some of you are probably familiar with object-based spatial audio mixing and mastering or recording techniques. The goal of this really is to kind of laser focus on 360 reality audio and primarily 360 Walkmix creator and how to make things in it. I'm not going to bore you with this slide. This is something that everybody is probably very familiar with, as it was the prevalent paradigm for many, many years. And that is just normal surround, where you have a discrete output going to a single speaker, and the sound was mixed in that fashion. we're sort of we're 3 phases past that. 360 Walkmix Creator allows you to output files that can be consumed by a publisher and then sent off to a distributor and played over a digital streaming platform. From the ground up, we actually, designed everything to be laser focused to provide a wonderful music listening experience in headphones. And it'll become apparent kind of how we're achieving that in a few slides. For now, I just want to go over basically what is 360 Walkmix Creator. It is a plugin that goes into your DAW, whichever DAW. We support pretty much all common, popular DAWs. There's a couple outliers, but for the most part, we've got all, like the big 6 or 7. And what is it for? It's for mixing, monitoring. We have it's broken up into two different components. One is 360 Walkmix Creator, which is a plugin for your DAW. The second is 360 Walkmix Player, and that is something that is used in playback to validate files that you've outputted via our plugin. And by files, I mean the formats that would be used for streaming spatial audio, such as MP4, aka MPEG-H, ADM, master ADM. And if you're working with Sony, SAM and WAV files, which are, audio and metadata, playing those back would be what the player does. There's also kind of an internal feature that we're using called extensions. We actually have kind of our plugin within a plugin system. For right now, it's one of the big challenges in spatial audio is making sure that, when things go through a renderer, there's no peaking or anything funky. So we actually have our first extension is a limiter extension. And let's go ahead and let's do just a brief. I'll just show you guys what I'm talking about, and it will all make sense, I promise. Oops, okay. So if you add the plugin to a DAW, this is the first thing you will see. This is the 360 Walkmix Creator plugin. And because we're working with, objects in 3D space, the first thing you'll be presented with is a very large 3D workspace. And I'll get to why this might look a little different than what you're used to. So as you can see, all of those balls represent an object. And what is an object? An object is 2 things. So if you look at kind of my inserts here, you can see that we've got the plugin at the very end of the insert stack. And the plugin itself sort of acts as an intermediary. This is all channel-based audio. This is all object-based audio. To translate, once the channel-based audio signal hits our plugin, we do a couple things. One, we have a bunch of data that works between our plugin and the master instance, which I'll go into in a second. And 2, actually the big thing is latency compensation. And 2, it's of course the audio signal. That said, we have 2 modes you can work in. One is we call this compact view. This is more just doing some tweaking and peaking, and probably not going to be the bulk of your workflow. It's just the convenient view, but you can constrain anything and into whatever view you want, so that you can actually get some precision with the objects and where you want to place them. And I usually like to work in perspective. And 2, obviously this is gain, and you can see the gain sliders. Now where it gets cool is if we go, this is the more sort of accurate view. This is focus mode or focus view. And this is how you would actually manipulate the gain. And then any of the parameters, the positional parameters that you'd want to put in here. We have headphone monitoring. So I'll get into that a little bit as well. And let's see here. And of course, a history stack in case you're like me and do something silly. Why is this cool? Well, you can actually edit elevation, width, azimuth, and all of those parameters are actually accessible via your normal DAWs automation framework. So if you're comfortable, you can actually latch or touch, and if you have plugin automation turned on, you can actually manipulate all the positional info and the gain, everything that way, or you can use the automation lanes in your DAW, whichever DAW you use, that also works. Really, the goal was to make sure that everybody could continue working in the workflow that's comfortable to them and most familiar to them. So it all works. It's just a couple extra parameters. And let's see here.
I like seeing that view, by the way, because I think that that spherical view, for one, gives a good representation of, if you're trying to visualize where things are, because it's different. It's not a room or a box, it's a sphere. This helps a whole lot. And the other thing I think is interesting about this too, is that when you've got level, you get indication on those individual objects that something is pinging them and they react to level. So you're getting signal in places you think you're supposed to be getting signal.
Perfect. That's absolutely correct. Yep. Let me go ahead and I'll bring the PowerPoint deck back up. And let's see here.
And I see there's a couple of questions. We'll get to those in a minute. But the other view that you had on there showing that you could also solo and mute each of the channels, and you could adjust the gain of each one in a couple of different places.
That's correct. Yep. And so, yeah, I mean, okay. And there's a reason, Michael's absolutely correct. There's a reason why we have things like solo, mute, gain, and we'll get to that. So one of the biggest challenges, if we reverse a couple years ago, when we first started this project with Sony, we were presented with two choices. One was, do we make a standalone application so that people can actually produce 360 Reality Audio based music on their desktop, or do we integrate into DAWs? Unanimously, almost everybody said, let's go into DAWs. I want to use Pro Tools. I want to use Nuendo. I want to use Ableton Live. And so we did. Because we have to work within a DAW framework, and because we're a hosted, we're kind of pushing the boundaries of what an AAX, VST, or AU is capable of. We act, well, I'll get to that slide. We act more like a system than a plugin. But backing up a little bit, I probably should clarify kind of what's happening when you're working in 360 Reality Audio and 360 Walkmix Creator. First and foremost, the sphere, you guys just saw that. That is where channel-based audio turns into objects, and that's in the plugin. There's a couple things towards the end of our chain, which are a pre-renderer, a renderer, and then an HRTF, which is a head return transfer function, which actually allows either a standard hearing profile or a custom hearing profile, so that you can hear the virtualization like either the masses are going to hear it, or specifically tailored to your hearing profile, so you can hear all of the subtle nuances specific to the way that your ears are laid out on your head. The pre-renderer is an interesting place. So as the signal goes from all of those track instances into our master instance, which I'll get to that, when you go to actually export out ADM or MP4 / MPEG-H, what the pre-renderer does is it actually calculates and does all of the complex math around how do we actually present different levels of audio depending on bitrate. So, and depending on, trying to provide the best quality of life for folks on a variable speed connection. So it may not seem like much. We do everything automatically, but at the time the pre-renderer is ran, the number of dynamic objects and the number of static objects and where they are in relation to each other in this sound field gets calculated, and then we can generate out whichever levels of audio you want to specify. The levels are level 0 all the way to level 3, just as is the MPEG-H spec. And level 0 is, would be obviously, we're trying to preserve the best fidelity and integrity in those files. So level 0 would be, hey, I'm on kind of a not so good connection, so play something that sounds good, and we do. Go ahead, Michael.
I was gonna say, let's come back to that when we get back to that section. I think that's a little deeper dive until we get to people understanding a little bit. So if you would, why don't you go to the slide that shows the insert, sort of the signal path. And let's show that so there's an understanding of the process of getting this on each channel, turning each channel into an object. Since we're touching on that, and while you're moving to that, just to Peter's question, is there a VCA for the gain? Yeah, there are ways to do VCA outside. So that's the beauty of using the DAW, is that your given DAW will allow you a way to do that. Bryce is about to show this right here, but for example, in Bryce, sorry, I'm going to steal some of your thunder, jump in here real quick, is that you have the ability in Pro Tools to be able to send, when you put the insert in, you have to create an aux send. You aux send it to the master, but you can VCA that. I use Nuendo. Nuendo doesn't need the aux send. The insert is post fader, which means I can just put a VCA on my faders. Other workstations work differently. So Peter, to your question, yes, there are ways to do that. And not within Walkmix itself, but that's why it's in a DAW right now. How'd I do, Bryce? How'd I do?
That was perfect. That was beautiful. Thank you. I'm very happy with that answer. That was perfect. The thing I'm about to show you is nowhere near as cool as what Michael just said. It is a very simplified sort of signal path for the audio chain as it relates to your DAW and your plugin. Like I was saying earlier, we're absolutely a system. And actually, Michael, I'm going to back up just real quick, just to kind of share that. It looks like a plugin. One of our biggest, I guess, challenges is trying to help people overcome thinking about things in terms of just a plugin. Because we're so familiar with VST, we're so familiar with AAX, AU, but the whole paradigm of plugins has been around for so long. We actually need to, under the covers, we need to actually pass latency compensation or latency measurements between every single track and our master instance. And that is a perfect segue to get to that. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so I'm sorry, the Q&A is blocking everything. Okay, so basically, if we were to kind of define the signal path, we start off with an input, right? That input is coming from channels, and you either have a stereo, 5.1 mono. All of that hits our plugin. Our plugin needs to be absolutely last in the chain here. Now again, this is not an aux bus, or we're not using a group in live. This is 100% Pro Tools, and our plugin has to be the very last in the chain. And why is that? We have two things that are coming out of our output. The first is some latency measurement signals. And the second, obviously, is our audio. And all of our audio is routed to the master fader. So when you set up the plugin, you'll actually set it up to say, hey, this is a track, this is a track, this is a track, and then if you're in Pro Tools, for example, you might have to create a master fader or a master track, and then put the plugin on that, and it will say, hey, am I a master track? And you say yes. And all of a sudden, that plugin goes from being like every other plugin in every other track, or every other aux bus, and becomes a kind of the brains of the operation. Inside that, we're actually inside the master instance, we're actually calculating all kinds of stuff. Everything from the health of all of the satellite plugins to how to compensate latency, there's a bunch more. And if anyone's interested, please feel free to ask Attila during the Q&A. But very simply put, because we're actually having to manipulate both audio and latency data between the plugin and the master instance plugin, we have to bypass the DAW fader unless, as Michael described, you're using an aux bus or a post fader like in Nuendo. So let's see here. Michael, was that what you were looking for?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that just sort of helps show the path a little bit. I think that's important
for sure,
to show where it goes and what's possible ahead of it or behind it, what's actually happening to the signal, and where does it stop and leave the channel? Where does it return if necessary? I see Brian's question there. I'm going to answer that here in a second when we get to that, but because that's something that can be useful here also.
Yeah, it's a good question too. I saw that.
Yeah.
And so as you can see, the plugin instance goes on the master fader, and then the plugin will either loop back out through your master. We have a setting in the plugin called host master, and very imaginative, very creative title, but it's called host master, and that's just an audio loop back that will allow you to play through whatever hardware your DAW is set to. If you're not using host master and not using our loopback, and you actually want to play out your hardware, the hardware that we use will need to be different than the hardware your DAW is set to be using. And the reason for that is, as you can see, we're sort of bypassing the internal audio pipe and using our own. And so, you know, a very good thing, very good way to get around that is by using aux buses. This isn't a traditional signal flow. This is really a very simple slide just to show you guys that, hey, we go from channel-based on the left into the plugin, or if you have a third-party plugin, you know, any type of, you know, let's say you want to put a reverb or, you know, some EQ or something on the track, it needs to go before our plugin. It hits our plugin, and again, up until this point, it's channel-based audio. Once it hits our plugin, it becomes objects in our ecosystem, and then everything goes to our master instance. And of course, once it's in our master instance, it gets played out through your audio hardware, or, you know, also your audio hardware, but through the DAW's master. So
we go back last slide. Yeah. And I think it's interesting just to note here that, and I think nice that you put this in this graphic, is that the objects can be of any composition, stereo, mono, stereo, 5.1, 7.1, you know, that's an important part.
Awesome. And so, yeah, and the big reason, so all of this seems really crazy. The big reason for all of this really is just so that we could get around latency issues and work well. There's a couple other things that we just don't have access to in DAWs today. We're working on that. For example, let's talk about setting up. I've kind of touched on this a little bit, but sample rate and bit depth, those are just standard, and those actually have to do with our output formats requirements. You know, I know the number one thing we hear is, why can't we do this in 96K or 100, you know, 192K or whatever? And that really has just to do with the specification for the files that we output, believe it or not. So just got a question around the 5.1 channel track base, and hopefully this will clarify it. So back to kind of just, you know, I kind of touched on, hey, we're used to plugins working as plugins, not as systems in our instance. So also back to, and this goes back to the 360 reality audio format, going back years and years before we even started making this tool. The landscape of spatial audio mixing was all done in Cartesian coordinates. It was done in a box, in a room. You know, if you were working on a video game, it could be a very large environment, but always with XYZ coordinates to position audio. 360 reality audio is, the reason I was saying earlier, it's kind of the evolution, is because rather than having positional audio, it's actually positional, but it is positional and in a sound field. And as you saw with the demo that I did of the plugin, you could see a little user's head in the middle of the sphere. And that is 100% how it's supposed to be. So there's a shift that needs to happen in the brain that says, okay, I'm no longer putting stuff in space. I'm putting stuff on the skin of a sphere, basically. And that seems to be another really, really common thing that people have questions about is, well, why can't I spread, you know, I want width and I want to spread these balls very far apart. Why can't I just move them outside the sphere? And the answer is, you know, very simple. You can do that just using gain and keeping them on the sphere. And it really has to do with our coordinate system. If you've made something in the past in spatial audio and it's in a Cartesian, you know, a Cartesian plane, you could perhaps convert all of the coordinates, or we could convert that. That's maybe a forthcoming feature. But for the most part, those two systems are incompatible, other than, you know, they all represent the same thing. It's just using a completely different set of math. So hopefully that wasn't confusing. Maybe it was, I don't know. You know, and I don't know if anyone wants to go deep into the weeds. So back to the question, if I made something in 5.1, so technically no, simply because it's sort of like stereo. We don't have any concept of the width of, let's say you recorded something on a Blumline pair, or it came in with a left and right signal. When it goes from being channel-based audio with a left and a right, it comes into our world as an object in spherical, spherical polar 3D space. So that said, those objects will look like stereo objects, but they really truly are two independent objects, one representing the input being left and one representing the input being right. Same goes with 5.1. When they come in, you'll have 5 objects and they'll be in 3D space. And if, at this point in time, they're free. They're almost like individual mono objects. The only thing delineating them as center, left, right was how they were recorded. And so, you can do all kinds of crazy stuff with that. And I've seen people doing all kinds of crazy stuff where they kind of break that paradigm, or they preserve it and treat things as stereo or 5.1 once it comes into the plugin. And so I don't want to go too deep on this because without having used the plugin, you guys might not grok it. This is a really good slide just to show you. We export MPEG, MP4, MPEG-H, SAM and WAV, unprocessed. There are times where you just need to do speaker channels, and that is unprocessed binaural output. 13.0 speaker channels, that's included simply because it's a requirement for a lot of publishers. Headphone channels, same. ADM and master ADM, as we know, those are open source specs. Our master ADM is a little different. You guys have probably worked exporting things to Dolby ADM. They're embracing ADM the same way that we are, in the sense that everything, all the positional stuff is to the ADM spec. But like Dolby, there's a proprietary chunk within that file format that they may write some of their renderer information. We would write our pre-renderer information and renderer information too. And that's where we differ. But for the most part, very similar files.
This is great. And well, back to the ADM and deliverables real quick then. So do you see it as a point? I know the answer to this, but do you see it as a point where there's a convergence and we end up with some agreement of being able to not only all deliver what each software may say as an ADM, but also interchangeability between the two, or between any given ADMs of the future?
I hope so. That's the goal. Obviously we exist because we want people to have a good experience and be efficient and get stuff on time and not have to sweat all the little things. So that's the goal, what you just described, Michael, for sure.
Cool. Let's go back to the setup real quick, because we're sort of, we're sort of away from our 30-minute presentation and Q&A, kind of a back and forth, and got a few questions in there. So maybe we'll just sort of carry on with this direction for the moment. But so if I would, then can you go and you talk real quick about setup and speakers? You talked about the 13.0 speaker, but will you refresh? I think you did a little bit last time, but I think refresh folks a little bit on the monitoring setup.
Yes, that's actually, let me go ahead and, in fact, I'll just share out my DAW while we're talking. That is a really good point. So we're aware that a lot of people have installations for spatial audio that have, primarily for Dolby. That is obviously the number one. And we actually are trying to be copacetic with that. And so that we have a bunch of pre-baked speaker configurations that should map, pretty closely to your Dolby setup. In fact, almost perfect parity in some cases. So,
well, and one aspect, and while you're pulling that up, is the difference between beds, LFEs, objects, but when I think of speaker setup, also with the Sony setup, with having in this idea of a sphere, you've got 3 speakers below the horizon. So there is actually a spherical aspect to actually even the speaker setup.
100%. In fact, I have seen more mixes done with drums and percussion down here that sound so incredibly good. I mean, 10 years ago, if you were to ask me, hey, Bryce, there's going to be drums under your feet, I would have thought you were insane, but it's amazing. And I don't know any other way to do that. But, and again, part of our render process is all of this stuff becomes a sound field around you. So when you're listening in headphones, having drums under your feet is ridiculously cool. I don't know. That's my 2 cents on that.
I just did a project recently, sorry, just as a real quick, is that the idea of where do you put stuff, and a kick drum in the ceiling. But the idea was the kick drum in the ceiling was the neighbor upstairs pounding on the ceiling, going, turn it down. So there are creative aspects for,
oh, that's
putting
amazing.
things like that in the floor and in the ceiling.
Oh, that's cool. I've lived that life. So there's the speaker layouts. I mean, you will probably recognize a lot of these. And these do map to speaker layouts. I kind of glossed over the slide that goes from Cartesian coordinates, aka room-based, theater-based audio to us, polar, spherical, sound field-based, spatial audio. And what's cool about the way we work is if you already have a setup that works, we should just be plug and play. One of the cool things about our company is that if you see a layout that you don't have, let us know. I bet we have it. We're sitting on hundreds of different speaker configurations. And so we're able to add stuff to the product probably for you. So if that's something, if we don't match you, let us know and we can make you whatever.
Can you talk real quick, the speaker mapping? Can you just explain that real quick? Just for folks that, what you're listening to as far as objects in a 360-degree sphere versus where the speaker positions are, and how do you handle that?
That's a really good point. So as you can see, so these are all of the speakers. And again, these are completely customizable. So if you have a speaker named Snoopy, you can name it Snoopy, or you could go with Center. That's the good ones. But if you can see the way the objects are, here's where the speakers are. And so these objects, after the pre-render pass, they get calculated for playback. With the renderer, they get calculated for playback and monitoring exactly where they appear in the sphere. So if you're like, let's say I've got cellos. I've got the cellos kind of over here. If you're playing this back, obviously there'll be some coming out of the center channel and some out of this one of the right speakers here. Whoops, I just lost cellos. And this is exactly how the sound field is generated. All of these, think of the objects themselves as sort of sound emitters, even though they're not. There's interplay and sympathetic resonance going on between all of the objects between your speakers, but when it comes out the speakers, it just sounds incredible. So it's not kind of that one-to-one surround that we're used to back in the day. This is definitely a new thing.
Will you solo those cellos real quick?
Sure.
Just so it shows it, you can see a better view real quick. Where they show up. Versus the speaker.
I can actually make this bigger, and I can actually. So this is. You can actually see all of the. I usually work with these off, and for obvious reasons. And then you can pick whichever ones you want. Obviously, solo does that. Mute makes everything gray. And it should be, hopefully, knock on wood, it should be a very, 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 very easy workflow. A lot of folks, some folks don't like doing, real quick, some folks don't like doing the gain there. Michael's suggestion about post faders or using aux buses is perfect. That it seems to be, what everybody's using. And again, until we get past that DAW limitation, which we currently have, which we're working on, that's kind of how we roll. So the other thing is, because there's some complex math happening, and because everything in the past was channel based, everything in our system is object based. And the number one thing we had, actually, there's more to this, was trying to make sure we don't peak or have any unpredictable peaks. Unlike a limiter that would operate on channel-based data, our limiter, this is part of our extension system, and you tell us what plugins we should make you in the future. But this limiter actually works on a per object basis for every object in this mix. So rather than having a limiter happening at the channel level, it's actually happening at the object level, which is super important because our renderer doesn't deal with channels. Our renderer deals with these objects, and playback deals with these objects. So we couldn't find, at the time we started this, we couldn't find an object-based limiter anywhere, so we made one. And so that's kind of the cool thing about this. But let's see, what else?
Will you show where that lives again one more time?
That's just right here by your channel.
And that's okay. And that is covering all of the objects simultaneously.
Yes. And in fact, let me turn it on. There we go.
Just for clarity. Yep.
And it is just it's a traditional look ahead limiter, and obviously a very, Spartan sort of UI. And the reason is because it has all of the stuff it needs, but really what makes it cool is the fact that it's object based, not channel based. So, and in the future, we're hoping to have, knock on wood, we're hoping to have some mastering functionality that is all object based, so that, so if you're a mastering engineer, you can do, EQ or dynamics or things like that. The other cool thing about having a sound field in 3D space is we can actually visualize things like EQ in real time using the spherical sound field and show you, hey, I'm really bass heavy down here, or wow, why is all my treble up here? You know, stuff like that. Sky's the limit. There's some sky's the limiter. There's some really cool stuff going. I know, audio joke.
I gotcha.
Okay, so the other cool thing that we do, and this is not something that I kind of showcased in the presentation, is because we're kind of circumventing a lot of stuff, people wanted the ability to do, and I don't have a file loaded here, but people wanted the ability to do A/B referencing and monitoring, and obviously in LUFS measurement, LKFS to LUFS, depending on which side of the pond you're on. And that's actually something we do in the plugin as well. Obviously integrated short-term momentary. That LUFS data, that loudness data will get written out to your master ADM files. If someone's requiring a master ADM, it needs to have LUFS data. It gets written out here. You can also use this for monitoring and reference stuff. And you know, if I click this, it will ask me to load a reference file. So there's a bunch of exports. I'm not sure if it's worthwhile because it kind of wasn't part of the original presentation, but I can show you guys. Let me see if I can do this.
Are you opening up a file for a project?
I'm going to actually open the player. Maybe I'm going to open the player.
So while you're doing that, something you said then, so the level data is baked into the ADM currently. You are putting that the level changes and keeping that. That's great to know that's actually moving forward. Next step is to get somebody to read it, but you can't read it unless you have it. So we start there.
And so it's actually crawling. So per DAW, we actually, if you export stuff, it automatically shows up in your library. Your library this isn't like a Spotify playlist. This is really stuff I've exported to the folder I specified in the plugin. Obviously you can add tracks in the future. You know, we're going to add support for making this a little more like a playlist. The goal with, you know, and again, the player just released about a month ago. So the goal with the player this time is very, very simple. It is to provide engineers the ability to play back the stuff they exported. Whoops. And so provide any sort of useful data, provide the ability to play back exported files in either, you know, with your custom hearing profile or your standard hearing profile on or off. And that's it. It is very simple. And as you can see here, I've got, you know, a level 3, a level 2, a level 3. Here's a BWF. This is an ADM file. It's a level 0. And this is just representing this song a song that I've exported in the past. So for everyone else, this is really just sort of the final proof before you go out the door. You know, unfortunately, right now, the plugin and the player come together. In the future, we actually plan to have a version of the player that allows artist preview, so that part of your publishing workflow could be, hey, I just mixed this thing and mastered this thing. I need to get it off to an artist for approval. And that's going to get baked in here. So that's just a little teaser about what's coming in the player. For right now, the primary target focus is probably everyone on this meeting. So
the QC aspect of it.
For the QC aspect of it, yes.
Yeah, and you can, an important note is your own profile in the player. You can, it's a separate instance of the headphone profile versus the Walkmix software.
That's correct. Yep.
So you can be queuing, you can be having, and so actually something else that's, I think it's really important is that when creating the final files, the headphone profile in Walkmix is baked into the file.
That's
so
correct.
If you put your own headphone profile into Walkmix, know that you just baked that into the master that you're making. Whereas using this for QC, you can put your own headphone profile. It won't affect the parts that are being made, and you can QC here in this player with your own profile and not have danger of your profile showing up on the master.
Perfectly stated.
The other part about that, and so if you want to talk about for a second, back to the speaker mapping, I don't know how many more slides you have because I'm going to transition into questions.
No, I think we're done. I just have a gotcha slide. but I'm not sure if that's going to be useful for folks that haven't used the plugin yet. So we can talk about whatever you want, Michael, for sure.
Well, I was just going to go back to the speaker setup and rendering, making masters. So when you're on export, when you're putting something out, the difference between where the settings need to be for folks to understand, again, the setup side of it, but also then what needs to be prepped and ready for if you're going to make a delivery, what do you have to be paying attention to?
Oh, good call. Yeah, we're the only thing we're picky about. And again, the bounce process, you know, a DAW baking out files, that bounce process is completely obfuscated to us. So we're kind of doing some sorcery. There's nothing the DAW will tell us to say, hey, we completed an export or not. So the only thing that's kind of a funky setup requirement is making sure that the export path, as you see here, kind of in the plugin, is set to the output path from the DAW. So when I'm doing the bounce and I get the bounce window in the DAW, it has an export path, and I make sure that that is set to the same one as in the plugin. And what'll happen is the window that you see kind of in this slide, that will actually pop up after the DAW has completed its export. The DAW still needs to do its bounce, but this export window will pop up after the fact. And that's when you'll get all your settings. One of the things that's not shown here is you can actually do a preview here as well before you hit export. So let's say, you know, you want to check for snats or pops or anything like that, you can. And for, you know, you literally can just select everything, select all the levels, hit go and walk away, go get a cup of coffee, come back. It's in some cases, it's really fast. Some things are a little longer than you might expect from a normal DAW, such as MP4, ADM, or sorry, MPEG-H, only because we aren't just exporting a raw file. We're actually having to take a lot of data and encode it into the MPEG-H format and put it out there. Shouldn't be too long. We've done a pretty good job of optimizing the encoding flow, but either way, for the most part, this should all be really super fast. So
I just got to say, it's way faster than it was when you had to do one at a time, one at a time, one at a time for each different level and all of that. So thank you for progress.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, this is, you know, all of this stuff, by the way, the thing I'm not going to show you because it's pretty dry and boring. Maybe somebody might like it. I don't. The user manual, all of this stuff is documented in the user manual with the plugin. I just really, I don't know you folks, but I like you already, and I don't want to subject you to that quite yet. So, might bear notice. Actually, Michael brought up a really good point, and I think we should probably say all of this stuff might make sense based on what I just said. So, you know, what are common gotchas? 99.999% of the time, when we get an issue via our support channels, it's almost always a misconfigured thing. And I mean, almost rarely. Gus and Michael both have probably found an actual bug, but for the most part, a lot of times it's just a misconfiguration. And everybody has their own way of working. Everybody has dissimilar hardware. Everybody has a dissimilar environment. Everyone has dissimilar everything. And so, you know, it's almost like no two environments are alike unless you're just doing headphones on a MacBook. That said, you know, a lot of the gotchas are setting stuff up the right way. And so just if you're going to use their software, probably a good idea to have some of this stuff in your mind so you can say, oh, I remember Bryce calling that out. That's what I'm seeing right now. The hardware faders aren't on aux buses or groups. You know, we have actually had people say, hey, how come my faders aren't working? That is because we completely end run the audio engine in the DAW, pump stuff through our master instance, and then either back into the DAW or out the sound hardware, which means, you know, unless you're on an aux bus or in Ableton, you can do it with groups. Your faders are not going to work.
Or Nuendo, again, VCAs.
Or Nuendo using, post faders for sure. Okay, here's my, if anyone's listening that can make post faders and every other DAW, please do. Thank you. The buffer size is less than 1024. Lots of times, hey, I'm hearing some snats, I'm hearing some glitches, and almost always it's their buffer size is too small, or they have a ton of other stuff running that's eating CPU. We don't use too much CPU. In fact, I would say the kind of varying degrees of CPU usage starts with, hey, I'm using headphone monitoring, probably uses the most because it's virtualizing on the fly, but everything else, pretty low CPU footprint. If you're running 95,000 things and you're peaking at, you know, 99% CPU, and then you add our plugin to your DAW and you hear glitches, I promise you it's not our plugin. Signal flow isn't reaching the master instance. That's another thing. Hey, I heard audio corruption, Bryce. Well, go ahead, Michael.
Actually, let me come back to that other one real quick. The other thing I found, and it's worth mentioning, is well, two things, because it answers a question in the chat or in the Q&A. Sorry, not the chat, the Q&A is I have noticed that good practice is to not have more than one window open at a time. If you're drawing on high screen, if you're drawing on like 4K, couple of 4K screens, and you've got a few instances of the plugin open, that's a draw and may cause some pops and snats. Just keep one open. You only ever need one anyway. You can access everything you need. And to the question that was in the chat is that yes, M1 machines or Mac Silicon and Rosetta both work flawlessly.
Yep.
Okay, carry on with your gotchas. Sorry, just want to get that in there.
No, that's great. No, yeah, I just saw the answered questions, and yes, we work flawlessly on M1 and Rosetta. In fact, there were a couple instances where we worked not because of us, but because of the DAW. We worked better in Rosetta than we did in M1 once the DAW made its migration, because there were some issues in the DAW. I'm not going to say which DAW, but anyways, so signal flow isn't reaching the master instance. That's again, if let's say you put some reverb, because our objects and our plugin is actually communicating both audio data and latency information. It needs to actually talk to our master instance, and the way it talks to our master instance, believe it or not, is with audio, because that's what DAWs understand. So we're actually using audio as a delimiter for latency compensation, and then the master instance calculates how to compensate for latency. That said, if you put a reverb on the plugin or on the track after the plugin, that reverb will skew any of our latency measurement stuff that's coming down the pipe. So it's, the only thing we ask is that we keep everything very pristine. If you want to put stuff on the channel side, meaning before the plugin, totally okay, because as long as the plugin has an uninterrupted flow between the plugin and the master instance, it won't disrupt any of the data passing that goes on between the plugin and the master instance of the plugin. Sample rate is not 48K. And that's okay. I've heard both the player and the DAW. The player actually inherits the sample rate from your settings in the DAW, or I think you can set it in the player as well. That said, I ran into a problem where my default for my audio device, my whatchamacallit, my interface was 40, 41, whatever. And so I just exported something, sounded great in my DAW, go to play it back in the player, and so I actually just realized, okay, I have to set that at the sound card. So 3 places to check: is your DAW set to 48K when you're working on a session? The plugin will always be set to 48K, and is your audio hardware set to 48K? So it just has to be ubiquitous across all the things. There's a whole myriad of external issues. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were moving on to the next topic, because I wanted to come back to the previous one real quick.
Go ahead.
There's a way to answer a question in the chat from signal flow isn't reaching the master interface instance. Brian had asked about analog inserts or analog work in that. And yeah, Brian, I've been doing that for years. It's easy enough to do in a couple of different instances. One is just as Bryce is saying, you can put an external effect insert anywhere before the plugin instance that changes the channel into an object. So if you want to go out and back in, you can do that easily as an external effect. Again, Nuendo, for me, it's just create an effect and drop it in as a plugin. And then you can do analog out and back. You just have to make sure that your signal flow reaches the master instance. Back to Bryce on that. The same thing if you're using something like the APB boxes. Again, been doing that for a long time, that those also work well because the export is real time. And so if you're exporting real time, you can do those processes easily within Walkmix, as long as your music or content is getting to the master instance, which goes back to the point you just made. So thanks for that. Let's go back on. Carry on.
That's perfect. Oh, that's perfect. So, and there's a whole myriad of external issues. Everyone's got to set up, sometimes even just having your sound card set to the wrong bit rate, having an external timepiece or an external clock that may mess with things, may or may not mess with us, but it's something worth checking. Having other plugins that are resource hogs stealing resources from us. We don't ask people to completely kneecap their production, but just be mindful that we're not the only plugin that uses CPU. We do use CPU, but and it's not egregious considering what's going on under the covers. In fact, it's amazing that we use as little CPU as we do, given what's going on under the covers. But just be mindful that there are other systems. And then we get a lot of reports of the DAW crashing, and it turns out, I'm not going to say the name of the DAW, but that DAW just randomly crashes for everyone with or without our plugin. So if it goes into the great beyond, believe it or not, we get all of the information. We actually have a system that reports all of the crashes that we see, and a lot of them are coming from someplace else. Even though it's like, I loaded the plugin's crashing. I'm not trying to deflect blame. We've had plenty of bugs, but just something to check. Make sure your other plugins aren't crashing. And then I kind of went over this when we were talking about exports. The bounce path in the DAW doesn't match the bounce path in the plugin. One thing to keep in mind, if you're running like me, I have multiple DAWs. I have 7 DAWs on this laptop alone. If you're running multiple DAWs, the output path that is set in the plugin is global. So if you have an output path and it's set to documents, exports, that will be ubiquitous across all all projects you're working on or sessions you're working on in different DAWs. If you want to have a different export folder per DAW, you totally can. Just be mindful to check your plugin settings to make sure that it matches whatever the DAW settings are. And then believe it or not, the plugin window being closed during export, kind of a weird one, but again, there's so much stuff going on in the DAW that we can't control. We just ask that, hey, the plugin window needs to stay open while you're doing an export, and then the export path will come up. So we lose the plugin window, we lose the context, we lose the ability to check whether the export's done, and bad things happen. Trust me, it would work differently if we had the power to fix it. So
the other gotcha on that one sideways is you've got the window open, but for some reason the plugin is turned off. So check the green dot, because I've done that many times. We're like, what? It's open, but I somehow it got turned off.
Yeah, I spend every day in this plugin, and I've done that multiple times. So you know what, Michael, that's actually a really good point. So one of the other questions we commonly get asked is, hey, I just want to do a binaural, I just want to listen to my mix in binaural. One of the things that the plugin has that's actually cool is an on-off switch. And that's one way that we kind of differ from a plug, that the challenge of the historical plugin stuff is you add a plugin, the plugin's just on. Hey, it's a reverb plugin. Listen, oh, reverb. I just added it reverb. For us, it comes in and you have to actually turn the plugin on. If you don't turn the plugin on and you're listening along going, hey, this is great spatial audio in 360 reality, 360 reality audio, I'm going to export this. Nothing will get exported simply because the plugin needs to be on. So, I mean, it will get exported. It'll be exported the way your DAW will export binaural audio or, 5.1 or whatever. But for us, it's, you have to turn the plugin on. Why that's cool though, is that you can literally be doing a regular mix, have our plugin on every track, just have it turned off and, just go about your business. And, you can literally use the power button as an A/B reference. So,
right, the one power button turns off all of the plugins at the same time.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
The other important thing to note, and I want to get some of the questions as we're looking at time here. But the other thing, and I want to make of note is, and we talked about this yesterday, is the master bus output that you're using this in is a stereo output. It doesn't need to be a 13-channel output or a 22-channel output or a 7-channel, whatever it happens to be. And I think the reason that's important is I've come across hardware that if it doesn't see a 16-channel device, for example, you can't even get to the binaural because it needs to see the channels before it can fold it down to make the binaural. In this case, with the Walkmix plugin, putting it on a stereo output bus is all you need, and it does all the even speaker assignment work within the plugin and not within the 2-channel bus structure of the master bus.
Correct.
Did I say that right? The reason for, okay, cool. All right. Well, because I think that's important for a lot of folks to know that they don't have to necessarily, they can get started with headphones and a 2-channel card or of some sort and still be as effective as having a, 64-channel output or something. So, But let's get to a couple of the questions. We got to get to, is that cool? Let's see. Anonymous, real quick. How does the limiter, this is probably for Attila, how does the limiter detection circuit work? Which is why we're glad we have him here. Will a signal on one object trigger the limiter to limit on a second object?
Yeah, as Bryce mentioned, that's a object-based limiter, and that just means the limiter, it's a brick wall limiter working on the objects one by one, but the side chain, what is driving the limiter is coming from the renderer's output, because actually also we will probably make more effects, more object-based effects in the future. That's what we are working on. But right now, this is a technical problem what this limiter is solving, because this whole format is designed to be rendered on the client side. So the listener phone will render it. So we can't really predict everything. So the whole 360 environment is a little bit unpredictable on the level. We still try to push it up. So we are using the output of the renderer for a 13-channel setup to limit every object. So that's the side chain. So we use a 13-channel input to limit up to 128 objects in the same linked fashion. And
Attila, sorry for interjecting. Just interjecting one thing. We also have a global peak detection that runs post-export. So in addition to having object-based limiting, if you have anything that's peaking, even after limiting, we still police that and offer you the ability to say, hey, do you want to normalize this because you just hit a peak globally? So we have both, I guess, is the right answer.
Actually, let me add to that then one more topic to that, Bryce, is that the limiting that you have on the export, it's a peak limiting. The normalizing is taking the peak to the top, not looking at LUFS. So if you're doing singles, that's one thing. If you're doing an album, be very careful about normalizing that peak to the top, because then you throw off your album balance.
I was totally not going to say that. Thank you, Michael. That's
You're not going to say that like you, oh,
no,
was I,
I
think that's important.
You know that. But yeah, that's great.
I think that's hugely important to know what you're doing at that stage, and what's happening is it's peak level. So good. Okay, cool. Let's see. Peter just says, is phasing a problem? Anybody want to handle that one?
Let's hear it.
I mean, this is I guess the question is for the renderer and the headphone virtualizer, and that's the Sony side of the things. And so some people told they don't like some of the HRTF profiles, what we use as a default, because they feel some people like those. Obviously, when somebody has a special profile, then that will be always far better. But it's really hard to tell. It's so much subjective thing. But obviously, the whole rendering process of penning something in 3D space can have gotchas, and that's what a lot of companies are doing differently, how they solve the phasing problems. Yeah, I don't know.
The other thing is good practices as well, of good practices of mixing, of knowing where you're going to get phase cancellation because you're combining things. So there's also an aspect of in the creative side causing phasing issues or not too. So mindful engineers paying attention to that also.
Right,
Yes.
like a mono vocal in the center will be less phasey than using a stereo stem for
Exactly.
a mono vocal.
Or a very short reverb or delay that's or a timing of two mics of an overhead off, or whatever, all of those things.
That's
Bryce,
right.
you were going to add to that? Did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say, so out of the box, we have on the mixing side, not on the playback side, but for the consumer side, but on the mixing side, we actually have a generic hearing profile that's used as part of the headphone virtualization. Honestly, how that sounds to you really is how close that generic profile is to your ears and your head setup. In the past, with lots of folks, we've generated custom hearing profiles, and that is absolutely a cool process. And it obviously, believe it or not, will solve if you hear some of the phasing that's due to the headphone virtualizer, then that solves some of that. But for the most part, the generic hearing profile by default, based on what Attila said, Michael said, and what Gus said, all of that is 100% true. And if you need a custom hearing profile, let us know. So
the profile makes a huge difference. It really
think so
does,
too.
because it takes the guesswork out of it. It's your own, you're not listening to an averaged version. Yeah, it does make a really big difference. And until we can get to a spot where you walk into any drugstore and put a helmet on and everybody has their own HRTF done that way, call you guys. The folks on this call, and folks that are here should reach out to you guys to make sure that they have their profiles. Let's go back to, because we're just at time, but I think we can get these last couple of questions out here real quick. When using 5.1 channel based track, does it auto assign your positions to LR, etc.?
I kind of touched on that during the presentation, and Michael and I showed sort of how your speaker configuration and your objects are kind of laid out in between some of the speakers. Honestly, the concept of left and right only applies to the input signal. So if it was recorded with a left and right signal, then it will come into the plugin as a left and right object, but they're not left and right. They're in 3D space in a sphere. So whatever you do with them after that is up to you. If it's 5.1, same. You will have a discrete input that became an object because it's one of the channels in that track. But for the most part, where you put that stuff in 3D space is totally up to you. So.
Maybe I misunderstood the question, but what I felt the question is asking. Yes, if we try to detect if it's a six channel track, then we try to lay out it as a 5.1 in the space automatically. And we are working on more, currently we are working on more general way of solving this, so people will be able to select if it's a SMPT or a film ordering and all this kind of things. Because we try to figure out how to space. The plugin only knows how many channels the tracks have, so we have to guess the positions, the initial positions. After that, the engineer will be able to move anything anywhere. It's just when importing, starting up, there will be a default positioning.
But right now, for the 5-channel, we're assuming ITU, correct?
Yeah.
Just did that the other day, brought something in and correct, it was, yeah. Oh, hey, Frank got, I think he was having problems with questions earlier. Actually, let's get Ronnie in here real quick. What is a good way to monitor LUFS levels, especially the metering, especially for meeting deliverable specs like -18? Meters.
That is the thing I kind of glossed over a little bit during the demo.
The question came before you.
Oh, is that okay?
Actually, yes.
So there's a reference tab in the plugin. You probably saw this, Ronnie, so I don't want to insult you, but there's a reference tab in the plugin, and believe it or not, that actually shows three different LUFS values. Based on duration, basically duration of sample set for the LUFS measurement, and you can measure LUFS both in the session that you're currently working on or project you're currently working on, as well as contrasting that with a reference file. For now, Attila can correct me if I'm wrong. I think we load only WAV files for reference files, maybe MP3s. I'm not sure.
We can load any of the normal formats, FLAC, WAV.
So just standard audio files.
Reference currently can handle mono and stereo. We would like to extend it to more complex reference files, but right now it's mono and stereo.
Gotcha. Okay, awesome. So yeah, that was the limitation, stereo or mono. Awesome. File format's not a problem. But the cool thing is when you would literally just, if you're working on the mix or you're getting ready to ship this off to QC or doing your own QC on stuff, you would actually just live in that reference tab, and play back and just monitor like you would anything else. Do referencing at that time if you need to, and we'll show peaks. We'll show violations of -18 or -16 or -14, depending on what your distributor requires as an LUFS. I think Amazon's like -16. Someone else was -14, but we'll see how long that lasts. Either way, it's there. So
Yep, metering's there. Thanks. I guess I appreciate you explaining that. Yeah, and the meter's there, which is awesome. You have to get it through the main full screen page though to get to that. So to be able to get that tab to come open. We are a few minutes over, so I want to wrap up. There was one last question there for Frank. Actually, there's another one with Frank. Change again on reference files. So let's get back to that. The one thing that Frank did ask was about delay compensation. He's got a latency issue going on. I know that he and I use the same workstation, and I'm not having that. So can one of you guys be in touch with Frank and help him solve that problem?
With pleasure.
Okay, great. Gus, you got that? Okay, so Gus, Frank, Gus. Awesome. You guys, thank you so much for doing this. There's a tremendous amount of things to talk about, but I love the fact that we got into this a bit, and there's some information there for folks that are investigating this. So Gus, Bryce, Attila, thank you so much for doing this. And Maureen, P&E Wing, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody watching. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Gus. Thanks to Bryce, Michael, Attila. Thanks to Candice Yang, our producer, and Jane Kim, our coordinator. And we'll see you back here soon for part 3 of Sony 360. Bye.